Hi, welcome to episode 56 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whitten, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by a longtime friend, Jeremy Parzen, who lives in Houston, Texas with his family. Jeremy has a PhD in Italian literature and is a widely respected expert on, yes, Italian wine. But what prompted me to see if Jeremy would be a guest on the show was actually a social media post that was not necessarily related to wine. But Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Michael, thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan of your work, and of course, I follow all your activism. I think it's great, and thank you for thinking of me for the show. Um, I my story. Which story? um,
Well, why don't we start? I mean, you were a left coast
well,
guy, you were a right coast guy. Now you're
geography.
living in the middle of Texas. Yeah, we'll start with geography.
Geography is, it's funny because, and that was my whole post was, don't judge me by my geography. My family's from the Midwest, Indiana. My dad went to University of Chicago Medical School. My brothers and I were all born in Chicago in the 60s. Um, and like many families in the early 70s, my family migrated. It was a moment when California, those are the moment that's like Jerry Brown's father was, building University of California, building, there was a big campaign to get professionals like my father to come, doctors, lawyers to come. They needed to populate California with professionals. And my father answered a call to come work at in San Diego, California. So when I was 3 years old, my family moved to La Jolla, California, pretty ritzy place to move to.
Yeah.
Um, uh, my first question to my parents when I, became aware of my new surrounding is, why are there no black people here? Because of course we came from Chicago where there, we lived with all kinds of people, and we moved to La Jolla where we lived. I mean, listen, with only at that time, even we're Jewish, obviously, if it's not apparent. And at that time, it was the first time they were letting Jews move to La Jolla. There was a covenant that essentially among the realtors who they just wouldn't sell houses to Jews. And when they built UCSD, one of the founders of University of California, San Diego, which today is one of the best universities in the world, Revell, the famous founder, for whom Revell College is named after, said, "Guys, if you don't let Jews in, we're not going to have a university." And my father, who later went on to do some really shitty stuff, and I hope potty words are okay on the podcast.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Some really bad stuff. But at the time, he became a professor at UCSD. He was part of the San Diego Psychoanalytic Institute. So I grew up in this very bubble, rarefied bubble of La Jolla, California. Tucker Carlson, who's been in the news this week, was not a classmate of my brother's, but a classmate of a lot of friends of mine who went to a private school called La Jolla Country Day. I mean, that's La Jolla, California. It produced Tucker Carlson, just to give you an idea of the
And Jeremy
white.
Parzen.
Well, it produced me too. Um, and I went to UCLA. I later went to Italy, lived on and off between Italy and United States for 10 years, moved to New York, lived in New York for 10 years. And then about 15 years ago, through my blog, I met Tracy and decided to move to Texas to be with her. Tracy and I share the same affliction, italophilia. She'd lived in Italy as well and was working in Italian wine at the time. And she wrote a blog, I wrote a blog. We literally met on the internet because we read each other's blogs. And we fell in love. We started a long distance relationship, and in 2008, about 15 years ago, I moved to Texas, and that's what leads me to that blog post of the other day, or the social media post. as soon as I established myself in Texas and started, at that time we were living in Austin. Austin was a very cool place to live. It was, right now Texas is the California of the 1970s. People are migrating here because, and I'm not a big fan of our state's politics, but especially under Rick Perry, whose politics, social politics, I totally disagree with. I'm diametrically opposed to. But he did his business friendly, tax friendly, all that stuff has created all this business opportunity. Everybody's moving to Texas. People from La Jolla are moving to Texas. So it's a very parallel moment. And as I started to live in Texas and started to, a lot of my work is me traveling outside of Texas, going back to California, going to New York. I'll be in Miami this afternoon, you know. And what I started to realize was that I'd go back to New York City, where I lived for 10 years. I lived in Brooklyn for 5 years. I lived on the Upper West Side. I mean, I'm a lapsed New Yorker.
Yeah.
And I would say, people would say, "Well, where are you from?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm from Texas." I mean, I'm not going to say to people, "Well, I'm from La Jolla, California. I lived in Italy. I lived in New York. I blah blah blah, da da da." No, I just say I'm from Texas because I feel, it's 15 years I've been here. I have two children. I'm the father of two Texans. I'm married to a Texan,
Yeah.
and almost invariably, uh, people recoil. I mean, they say the most outlandish things to me. How can you live there? What's wrong? Oh, you live in Austin. Well, I don't live in Austin anymore. I live in Houston. It's terrible. And the other day, I was at a wine. It's about 6 weeks ago, maybe. I was at the Gambaro Rosso wine event, and I think I ran into someone who I used to consider a friend, who I think had a little too much to drink, and he just laid into me. "Oh, you're from Texas. You live in a bubble. Like living there because it's segregated." I said, "Listen, you have no idea what our life like is here. You have no idea what." Uh, uh, my life politically is, or what I do politically. And he wouldn't stop. He said, "Oh, I'm way far left of you. You could never be as left." I'm like, "What are you talking about? You have no idea who I am. I thought you knew who I was, but obviously something's not, maybe it was synaptic that day." And he really laid into me, even accusing me of being living in Texas because I'm a racist, and I like living here and raising my children here
Oh
because we
God, I'm so
want.
sorry.
And you know we're talking Tucker Carlson level of absurdity here,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
where people
Yeah.
just refuse. I mean, I get it all the time, and I'm the first one. I'm very vocal about it, as you know. Even my own family, it's, "Oh, well, you live in Texas because you can't afford to live in California. You live in Texas because you couldn't cut it here. You couldn't cut it in New York." No, I live in Texas because I fell in love with a beautiful Texan, and actually, this is a great place to raise my children. And actually, unlike my childhood, my children go to school with every gradation of humanity. And even more importantly, my children, this is something extremely important to me because my own growing up still resonates with me. My children, whether they're going to the fast food, or whether they're going to a restaurant, or whether they're everything they do out in the world is they interact with all kinds of people. Now, where I grew up in La Jolla, California, that was not the case. Even when I lived in New York City, I mean, looking back on my years in New York City, you get on the subway with every kind of people, but do you interact with every kind of people every day, other than um, and so it's been really disheartening for me, the way people just immediately make these assumptions. "Oh, you live in Texas, you must be a supremacist, you must be a racist, you must like Confederate flags, you must you're complacent in the national conversation about racism, about racial violence, about racial justice." When actually I live in a city where we have a black mayor who's finishing, I guess, his second term. He's finally, we're probably going to have a black mayor, Sheila Jackson Lee. I don't know if who, by the way, together with my congressperson, well, my ex congressperson, because I just got gerrymandered, which is a really I need to write about that. Tracy and I got gerrymandered by the very aggressive gerrymandering Texas government. But my previous congressperson and Sheila Jackson Lee were the congresspeople who introduced legislation to make Juneteenth a national holiday. And I mean, that's what my Congress people are doing. They represent me, and I think that gives you a sense of what our city is. Our city's it's the most by most accounts, it's the most diverse city in the United States. Like I said, my kids go to school with all kinds of people, not just kids who look like them. We have this immense, I was not a big fan of Anthony Bourdain, rest in peace. I know, he's an interesting figure. I was just not the biggest fan. When he came to Houston, if you ever, I don't think you can find it on the internet anymore, and just to bring it back to our connection between food and wine, the first thing he said on his show about Houston was in the opening of the show, he says, first of all, I have to say, everything I assumed about Houston was wrong. This is a great food town. It's a great people town. It's a great diversity town. I mean, he said, the classic East Coast, pseudo intellectual snob who comes to Houston and says, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea." And I think that if most people came here, they would have that same impression. Of course, no, not a lot of people want to come visit me in Houston. I mean, I'm a big advocate for our city, and there's so much I could say about why I love the city, why I love raising my children here. But just keeping it on topic, I really see Houston as kind of the future of America, and this really leads back to what you do, Michael, and that is that this is also a city. Again, my children, they go to school with every gradation, to borrow an expression by the recently departed Michael Gerson, a conservative writer, every gradation of humanity. They do. They interact with all kinds of people all the time. There's all kinds of people at my house because they bring their friends home, because we have parties, because, all this stuff. But it's also the city. And remember, we're a liberal city. We're a democratic city. By the way, Houston, I keep going back to my advocacy for Houston, is the model city for mitigating homelessness. Even my friends who are activists in California, homelessness activism, tell me, they're like, Houston, I want to come to Houston. This is the city that's really making progress. And we can talk about that too. But the thing that I think really takes us back to you and your work is that it's also a city where a lot of white conservative, historically, Houston was a terribly racist place. If you go back to the 60s, if you go back to the 70s and even the 80s, that's all changed as the demographics of Houston have changed. And interestingly, it's important to point out that it's a lot, in great part, thanks to Republican business policies that have made Houston such a diverse city and such a less segregated city. I mean, you should come see my neighborhood. My neighbors are different, look different than me. There's some that look like me. There's some that look very different from me. And that's part of the story of Houston. But we also go to school with ultra conservative, and I'm just going to say it, MAGA cap wearing, just like the diverse people we have in our neighborhood. We also have people with anti-Biden signs out and signs that conflate Christianity and Donald Trump. And so it's a city where all, even, when I say all gradations of humanity live, it's also that. And you don't have that. I mean, if you go to Oakland, which is a city I love, it's a majority black city. There's so many black businesses. Oakland is a model city. You don't find a lot of white conservatives there, And I think that's something that's really interesting about Houston. And one last thing, and I know I'm not letting you get a word in edgewise, but you said you wound me up and said go.
Yeah.
And
Let's go.
that leads me to Tracy's family. And there's nothing I would say here that they, Tracy comes from not from Houston, but from Orange, Texas, which is on the border. If you take the 10 freeway across America, you stop in San Antonio, you stop in, if you're heading east, you stop in Houston. The last town in Texas on I-10 heading east is Orange, Texas. It's right. It shares a border with Louisiana. It's historically one of the most racist places in the United States. And I know that partly because I've spent a lot of time there, but partly because my cousin, who is a historic activist, has written quite a bit, has studied. He's a professor of law at Texas Southern University, historically black college, university in Houston. Um, I went to a historically white university, by the way, called UCLA. That's a joke. It's true, but it's just for humor. And the reaction, the Reconstruction era reaction in on the border with Louisiana is severe. And remember, Texas was the franchise state of slavery. Davy Crockett and Sam Houston and Lamar, all those guys, they were actually fighting to keep Texas the expansion team for slavery. Slavery had just come to Texas, and
Mhm.
there was this
Mhm.
whole concept that it was going to become as a matter of fact, in Galveston, black people weren't even told for 2 years that they'd been freed. It took 2 years for that after the emancipation. So it is an extreme, and that pocket right on the Louisiana border, partly because the Sabine River is there, and one of the most famous battles of the Confederate War, the Civil War, was fought there, and I can tell you all about that. It is one of the most racist places. I mean, during Jim Crow, I mean, just awful lynching, intense segregation, and even up until the 1990s, there were these in the so-called Golden Triangle, which was formed by Vidor, which literally into the 90s was still a sundown town. The town where Tracy comes from is actually pretty well integrated because there's big industry there. There's oil refineries. That's where a lot of the oil refinery it stretches from Houston all the way into Louisiana. And Tracy's father was worked at a DuPont, nylon facility, blah blah blah. So and Tracy did go to an integrated high school. Around her, there are totally segregated. I'll never forget being at her house in my first visits. Maybe it was Thanksgiving, one of our first Thanksgiving, and of course we're watching the local circuit football because that's a thing in Texas. And I'm watching
Yeah.
Bridge City play Tracy's high school. It's Thanksgiving. We're sitting around drinking after the meal. Just hanging out. They like to visit, as they say in the South. Um, and I said to one of Tracy's uncles, I said, "Is that possible? But are there no black players on the Bridge City high school team? How's that possible?" And he started to laugh. Well, there's a lot of things you got to learn about. Uh, uh, where this place you uh, uh, married into. Now, Tracy's family are decent, respectable, and respectful people. You wouldn't consider them outwardly racist. They're good people. Even though they've lived, and that's been this big eye opener for me, is loving people who are. As a matter of fact, my mother-in-law loved that post. She said, "Jeremy, you really captured how we feel." And I this is something that I never imagined until I really became part of the Southeast Texas family, where I go to Thanksgiving with people who are MAGA all the way, people who voted for Trump, in both elections, who would probably, some of them, I don't think her parents would anymore, her dad would anymore, but he voted for Trump, despite being a Christian. He's a Methodist pastor that's his second, actually the second of his three careers. Now he's the mayor of their small town, West Orange.
Wow.
And that's really loving people that in a previous chapter of my life, I would have liked to, oh, you live in Southeast Texas and one of the most racist places in the world. You are, I'm canceling you. Uh, uh, when you have these type of experiences, you realize that we're all human beings, that all, you also, I've come to realize that, and it's funny. I mean, my in-laws are not extreme like Tucker Carlson, but they feel this aggrievement that they're very aware of it, that they are written off by the rest of America because of their religious views, because of their but they're not bad people, and they have, you know, every one of us, including you, including me, we're all of an age that we can look back to a time in our lives when we made an unfortunate, comment, or we made a generalization, a stereotype. We're all evolving, and I've watched. It's no small change to bring home a Jew with a degree from a West Coast elite university. I mean, I am like, I could have been an alien, and the way
Yeah.
they've embraced me, the way that there have been some moments of tension, but there's been resolution, and that is what has really opened my eyes to, I think, the biggest problem in our country. Obviously we have to affront racism. We have to affront racial violence is a huge problem in our country. These are all, overlapping issues, but we also need to pay attention to those quote unquote awful people, as my sister-in-law, who lives in a fancy house in Point Loma, California, but same thing as La Jolla. Uh, we need to treat them like they're our fellow citizens. They're human beings. They are part of all those gradations, and they're evolving too. Just like I don't listen to Leonard Skinner anymore. As a kid, I loved Leonard Skinner. And looking back on it, it was probably insensitive of me to play a Leonard Skinner song when I was playing music with my black. Uh, I used to play with all these, uh, guys who were in my band, and they all kind of smirked and said, "Okay, there goes." Looking back on that now, I tear what little hair I have. I'm like, how could I do that? We're all evolving,
Right.
um, and and they're evolving too. And I think it's been an eye opening, having this uh, extremely liberal Jewish pseudo intellectual, well, I would say I am an intellectual, not a pseudo intellectual, son-in-law in their family, has gone from being a curiosity to some moments of tension to, wow, we're all in a better place, including me and my evolution, and saying I can't write people off because of their geography. And
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
what, just to bring it full circle. So sorry for that very
No.
long-winded opening.
No, no. I think
Um,
the way I think about it is that the steps that have been made with racism and even like I guess like anti-Semitism and like there's lots of different ways that people kind of we look at people and that we discriminate against people. And I
mhm,
think that the next challenge for us is we need to think about the discrimination in our minds, the stereotyping in our minds based on geography and based on the politics. And I think that it doesn't mean we should forget about the other ones. We need to keep those and continue to walk forward. And to me, I've kind of started thinking about like it's really should be less about what you believe and more about how you believe. And
mhm,
I think what that goes to, and maybe you can relate to you've had the same feeling with wine, but the people that I always enjoyed working most with weren't necessarily the smartest. They were the curious ones. And the one of my all-time favorite, I guess, insights was in Barolo at Cavalotto's winery. In their
mhm,
tasting room, they have bottles from all over the world, and I don't even know if they have any bottles from their own winery. And what that said to me was like, and I guess you can now just like to politicians, right? You know that where if you're a winemaker from a certain region, you're going to be proud of your wines and you're going to advocate passionately on behalf of your wines. But there are the winemakers who will talk dogmatically about what they do and only their wine is good, and there'll be others who are more open and be like, "I love mine," and you understand that, but they're also constantly exploring and respecting all the other ways wine are made from all over the world. they don't close their minds off. And I think that what you want in a politician is, yes, advocate on behalf of what you believe in, but don't treat other people with the contempt and disdain and stir that up in a way that gets everybody like kind of hating each other. We should make the world exciting and make it curious and make it, something that you want to explore and learn more about, not something that makes you scared and hateful. And I
Well,
think
and
that both parties are guilty of that.
it's a great analogy, and I think it's so important to, again, when I'm in Orange, Texas, or when we get invited to, our kids play with conservative kids too, you know, is to remember that all, just like that Alfio Cavalotto saying, I look at all wine. All wine is part of my story, not just my wine or the wine of my village or my region, appellation, is to see the value, just like Alfio seeing the value in drinking a California Chardonnay, which would be a wine we might be prejudiced against, right? We're prone, as soon as you say, that's a great analogy. It's like,
Yeah.
you say California Chardonnay, people are like, "Oh, I can't drink that. It's oaky and butter." Well, did you try it? I used to be prejudiced against California Chardonnay. Now we drink more California Chardonnay than any other wine because I spent enough time in California wine country, and is to see the value. Just because you don't like it, or just because you don't share its ethos, or just because you don't know, doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. Just like, an incredibly oaky, buttery bottle of Chardonnay can have value in the context where it was meant to be. It was
Right.
intended to be, and
Yeah.
there that I see the analogy. I'll never forget. Vidor is a particularly virulent. It's a town village. I'm like thinking wine village. It's a small town in southeast Texas. It is historically one of the most racist places in America. There's just no getting around it. A lot of my black friends will talk about, hey, in Houston, will say, my parents told me never to stop in Vidor on the way to New Orleans. That's just the bottom. And to this day, there are not a lot of black people there. And I actually, because of my activism, I had a meeting at a beer garden in Vidor, and I had to drive over to Vidor to meet some people that I was going to be hoping to be working with, and ultimately did do some work with. And just the thought of like driving to Vidor, I kind of got, wow, I'm going to Vidor. I better be safe, And I go to this beer garden, and everybody in the beer garden, there's no black people there, there's no brown people there, there's no Asian people there, there's just Duck Dynasty. It literally looked. Just to give you, everyone's seen. I've never seen the show, but I've seen. People wearing hunting gear, lots of beards. No one's. If they're drinking wine, it's Moscato. This is we're. And I remember walking into that place and feeling like, oh my God, they're gonna kill. Like, what are they gonna do to me when I walk in there? And then I walked in and I see these folks, and I order a beer and I sit down, and I realize, what is wrong with me that I've come with all this baggage to this place, when actually these are just regular people who just happen to live here. It's not, who knows why they live here. Their families are from here. They have a right to live there, even if they disagree with, the community's history and all this stuff. And I realize that knowing my family in Southeast Texas has given me the language and the cultural references to feel comfortable there. And it really struck me. I thought, like, if my friends from California or New York walked in here, they'd be completely freaked out, just uh, and it's because they've never spent the time to speak the language of these people, just like those people might not know our language. And that really that really was I know it seems like a small, for me it was a huge moment, saying, why am I scared to be here? I actually know people in common with these people. I have mutual
Yeah.
friends. If I dug deep enough, we'd find out that they know my father-in-law because they worked at the refinery together or whatever. And it
Right.
really was a big eye opener, judging people because of where they live. We could go back to California and say, you know, is everybody, are there no racists in La Jolla? I mean, it's one of the
Right,
most
right,
segregated racist places I've ever lived in my life. I mean, and it
right,
still
right.
is to this day. And if we go to Central California, do you think we're not going to find a bunch of MAGA? I mean, look at New York. As soon as you leave New York City, my father lives up in Plattsburgh, near the Canadian border. I mean, that's one of the most racist places you could think of, but it's in New York State,
Yeah, yeah.
and we need to learn how to speak their language too, and we owe it to them, not to put up with their any racism, but to treat them like human beings.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, like, and what you were feeling, and I imagine I would feel, is in some respect, like, it's almost like maybe the familiarity makes us more willing to kind of give in to the, like, I don't know, fear or whatever. But like, if I was in Vietnam, right, and when I go to Vietnam, or I lived in Japan, I didn't look like anybody there, but I didn't go out there with, like, I mean, I lived in Japan, like, 2 generations ago we were at war with Japan. We dropped, like, there's a lot of
Yeah.
hostility in that, but I didn't go to Japan walking around like thinking about all the bad things that were there or bracing myself for the worst. You don't go to Germany and brace yourself for the worst. You don't go I mean, Italy, where we have, I've been to almost every region in Italy. I love it there, but Italy was on the other side of the war like in World War II, and these are all countries that we don't go into it and bracing ourselves for like all the bitterness and the bad things that are there. We go curious and open, and I think that, to me, is like, if I was in the shoes that you were in that situation, it's understandable to be like, this is an unfamiliar setting. I don't know what it's going to feel like. I feel a little uncomfortable. But I think to just stop there and then cancel it out and not do it is one thing. But to say, like, you know what, I'm going to go forward and be open minded and
Hmm.
curious, just like I would be if I was going to go to an area where there's a lot of Latino or a lot of Black, or if I was in visiting a foreign country. We have to, I guess, push ourselves to get uncomfortable and push ourselves to engage and be curious.
Yeah,
And
I could
you've been
say
living that.
I can say the same thing. I mean, I mean, look, there's one black owned bar in Orange, Texas, and the first time I walked in there, I got a lot of funny look. I mean, people looked at me like, "What the hell is this guy? Who is this guy? Why is he here? There's no, white people don't come here." And I mean, you could say, uh, I'm just trying to make this analogy of walking in the bar in Vita or walking in the bar in Orange,
Yeah.
and it's the same thing. And it's all about casting off. I mean, I love what you just said about Japan, I mean, Italy, Germany. I mean, Italy, in another 2 generations ago, I couldn't have had the teaching gig I have in Italy, because I'm a Jew, you know.
Right.
And actually, I mean, one of the interesting things about Italy is that they're Catholic. They have an advantage. Catholic people do have this kind of common denominator of, like, human life no matter where it is or how it was shaped, is human life, and that's a very Catholic idea. And I've seen people
Mm.
in Italy who, in their personal lives, might be completely racist with comments and jokes, yet if they see someone in distress, they're gonna be the first to say, "Come in and out of the rain and have a seat. I'll make you a coffee." I mean, it's a very Italian thing, and we tend to, because we go to Italy and we only look at the artwork and look at the wine and look at the food. We're not thinking that, wow, there's a big racist legacy here. Yet they've dealt with it in a different way, and as much as racism is still a big part of the conversation there, they have a totally different approach to it. And by
Yeah.
the way,
Yeah.
I get the same shit when I go to Italy and I say, when people don't know me and they say, "Well, who are you?" I'm like, "Well, my name's Jeremy. I live in Texas. I'm from Texas." I get the same thing. So, you know,
Well, the other thing, when what I value with wine is that there's two parts to it. One is like I feel like if you as you're learning about wine, when you first like hear about Italian wine, it's just like Italian. It's this monolith, right? But then as you delve in, you start learning about all the differences, and you start learning about how northern Italy is different than northeastern Italy is different than northwestern Italy, and the north is different
Mm-hmm.
than the south, and Sicily, which is its own little area. Like this, you start realizing all these differences, and like one of the things like I'd say to people is that like if you live in New York and you have to like we can't look at the rest of the country and think that it's all the same. Like if you're in wine, you understand the differences in geography and how one part of Italy can be very different than another
Mm-hmm.
part of Italy. And in the US, like how could you think that like I guess I call it terroir. Like we're all products of our environment, just like grapes are. So
Mm-hmm.
if we want to understand another country, we have to understand like Texas, as much as there are so many things that we read about in New York that are different, Texas is also, I mean, it was its own country for a while. It was under like what, six different flags. Like it's a
Mm-hmm.
totally different way of existence and way of seeing the world than the way we live in New York. And not to say that there aren't universal things we can discuss or aspire to, but like it's a completely different frame of reference. And the challenges that you confront are different than the challenges that I confront, and they're different than the challenges that are confronted in La Jolla. So we need
Mm-hmm.
to stop focusing on those differences. We need to stop looking at people with all this set of assumptions
Mm-hmm.
and learn to kind of get along. And the fact that you, as somebody who would definitely identify as strongly Democrat, I guess for lack of a better term, would find a fellow Democrat from like New York and face kind of like hostility is
Mm-hmm.
kind of that tells you the dysfunction. And I think it goes to me to again to the idea of like, I don't care what your party you are, I don't care what your beliefs are, I care about how you believe. And I think that's what, I don't know how we push the dialogue in our country to that direction, but I think that's what matters is, can we talk?
Well, I think, look, some people say it's the worst time in America to be a young person. Some people say it's not the worst time. I actually say it's the best time. You know why? Because for the first time, we're talking about really being a democracy. We're talking
Yeah.
about, we're talking about that we've been killing young black men. That we've been, I mean, I'm sure your listeners don't need me to go through the litany, but we're actually having that conversation for the first time. It's
Yeah.
pissing off a lot of people, but it's actually a great time. When I was a kid, it was just status quo. When you were a kid, I'm a bit older than you are, you're still part of, we're saved that where everything was hunky-dory and America was great and America's the best place to live. It's the least racist, turns out it's the most racist place to live. uh, um, uh, you know w- just like we owe it to the black community to be honest about Jim Crow, about what black people have had to deal with and are still. I mean, we're still killing black people. We read about that every day in the paper. Uh, we also and owe it to the white people. And I'm not saying I'm not pulling a Kanye West here or a Donald Trump here. I'm not saying white lives matter, that kind of bullshit. I'm talking about we can't write off everybody. I mean, I don't want to go into all the details, but you know, my in-laws, their parents had different attitudes than they did, and they have much more enlightened attitudes. I'll just leave it like that than their parents did.
Right.
And their parents lived through Jim Crow. My father-in-law was born in 1950, so the year I was born, he in 67, he was 17 years old in Orange, Texas. Can you imagine what it was like for a black person in Orange, Texas at that time? No brown people, no Asian people then, just white and black. And it was not a good time. We owe it to them to treat them as human beings too. Just because they came from a place uh, uh, where a lot of people were doing bad things to people because of the color of their skin, it doesn't mean that their children have to, And like I said, we all need to give each other space to evolve. And
Yeah.
it's no one's.
Yeah.
My wife Tracy was born in one of the most racist places in America, yet today she married me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
she's out. I'm pretty far left, and so is she. So again, it doesn't mean she doesn't love her parents. And it doesn't mean her parents are bad people. They're not bad people. They have different beliefs than I do. but it doesn't mean that their beliefs and their don't have value, that their lives don't have value the way my life has. And I think that and that's why I love what you do. And you and I have had some conversations before you started your activism. We can't forget them. And that post I did the other day, a lot of people in Texas said, "Thank you, Jeremy, for saying,
Yeah.
you know, for saying, hey, just because we live in, there's all kinds of people here, including me, including Tracy, including my in-laws, including, the Nelsons. I hope they're not listening. Who are super conservative, but our children are friends. And so, just like the Hendersons, who are super liberal and live down the
Yeah.
street. That we're friends, and that's been the big revelation for me. We need to
Yeah.
love white
I
people
hope they
against
are
it.
listening. I hope they all are listening. No, because I think this is I think we got to I think I want to lead with curiosity. I think that's what we have to do. And I think that's how I would perceive that's how you are with like one, and that's how you are as much as possible with your feelings. I think, and we all have issues. There are things to be reasonably fearful of. There are things that reasonably can make us fearful. So we're human beings and we're going to have our own shortcomings, but I think we just need to be more aware of it and keep pushing back at that and keep engaging people. So, I love talking with people who might not think like me and people outside of New York, because it's just we're all human, right? And it's cliche to say it, and it's one thing to say I want you to recognize me as a human, but we have to respect. But I always say like I'm trying as hard as I can to to make sure that I am treating everybody else as human. And it's not just, when I led a group of kids down to South Carolina and we talked about engaging people with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. And I say, like, it's not just about doing this to build political bridges, but you also got to do that with, with people back home, with that guy who delivers you the food in the
Mm-hmm.
rainstorm. Like that guy deserves the same treatment. This isn't just about, oh, build bridges, so we need to treat conservatives this way or Republicans this way. No, everybody. It can't just turn it on or off. And that's our challenge as human beings, is always got to be there. Yes, you should care about blacks who have been subject to racism for generations and generations, and so many other groups, but everybody, you don't know their situations. And that's it's hard to do. It's not easy to do. So we can't get frustrated, but we got to keep fighting the good fight. So I know you've got to wrap up to
Yeah.
get out on a flight. So I appreciate you squeezing this in before you go out. But can I just finish up with one last question, which is just like, so what gives you hope at the end of the day?
Well, and Michael, thanks for having me on your podcast. And I like I said, I'm a supporter and I'm a fan. Um, you know, I think that everybody should come visit me in Houston, Texas. No, I think that people, the thing that gives me hope is that we're starting to talk, uh, uh, I think that wokeism, Black Lives Matter, all these things, there are extreme expressions of these things, and may they come, but and everything, we all need to be aware of treating each other well, and the excesses that our political passions can bring. Having said that, it's the first time in our history that we're actually talking like a democracy. I mean, that's what's scaring the Tucker Carlsons of the world, is that our country was not a democracy even after the civil rights movement and the Lyndon LBJ signing into law the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, all this stuff. It's not like overnight we suddenly started treating black people and brown people and other people as equals to white people. No, that Jim Crow continued. I mean, I see that on the ground. When even in the 1990s, black people couldn't be in Vidor, Texas after dark. It was a sundown town until pretty recently. I mean, if you think about it. So the thing that gives me hope is that we are actually talking about it for the first time. Black people are actually, we're saying, God, we got to stop killing black people. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but that's what's happening, and that's what we live in a time of big cultural transformation, national transformation, and like I said, uh, you know. Uh, Economically, we live in a time when anybody in this country can have a stereo, a car, a cell phone. It's the best. I'm a bourgeois in 2023. I wouldn't have liked to be a bourgeois in 1865. Think about your middle class options back then. And I think that we live in a time of relative economic. Everyone's freaking out about the economy. No, the rich people are freaking out about how much less money they're gonna, you know, we even the poorest people who are facing inflation and all this rising prices, we still live in the best. There's still people who go hungry in America. We actually live in a time when it's not the Dust Bowl, it's not the Depression. We actually live. We have relative financial security. We have relative, despite all the school shootings and all that stuff. We still have relative. We live in a relatively secure place. You add to that we're finally talking about becoming a real democracy. That's what the real tension here is. The whole Republican moves to gerrymander, to disenfranchise, to stem voting rights. That it's because black people are voting now.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
finally turned the corner on the whole poll tax and reciting the Constitution. All the bullshit that played out during. And listen, it was in California too. It might have been more subtle, but it was equally. The same things are happening in California. Same things are happening in Oregon. Same things are happening in New York, where black people were disenfranchised, just like they were in the South. It may have been done with different language. It may have been done in a more subtle and less obvious way. For the first time, we're actually talking about all that crap. And to me, that's that's the beginning of finally. We're still not a democracy because we're still facing all kinds of voting rights issues. I was literally gerrymandered. Last in the last voting cycle, I downloaded my sample ballot. I'm like, I'm in a different district now. I was literally uh, uh, 2 blocks of my district got shifted to, and I won't go into all the details, but I got
Mhm.
gerrymandered. I have a new, and there's less liberal people in my old district to vote for the liberal congressperson we put in 2018 in the blue wave that ended a legacy that started with George H. Bush. He was the representative from my previous district. So that the fact that we're having this conversation, and I see the reaction of the Tucker Carlsons. We've been talking about replacement theory, and of course, he was this very extreme racist, continues to be an extreme racist. Uh, uh, those guys are freaking out because we're finally having that conversation, and that gives me a lot of hope that my children. I had really hoped my children would go up in a world. My children already get shit for being half Jewish, for being not being pure Christian white. They do. And I really hope my kids would grow up in a world where they wouldn't have to deal with that. They do have to deal with that, but they are growing up in a world where the conversation about how black people have been treated and brown people and other non-white people have been treated, non-white eligible people have been treated, and they also understand. They're also growing up in a world where they understand their own white eligibility. Technically, my children are not white. Their father is a Jew, so they're Semitic, and that for the hardcore white people, that doesn't cut it. They're only white eligible, but they're growing up in a world where we're having those conversations. And it
Yeah.
doesn't mean I'm right. It doesn't mean anyone else is wrong or right. But we have this dialectic, and that gives me great hope.
Yeah, and I think to me some of that expansion of that dialogue is also like I feel like you hear more and more people talk about the economics being almost more of an issue than just that too, which is like there's a lot of economic oppression
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that, which even transcends that. And then when you think about it that way, you all of a sudden have more, I think, more unity amongst people, is to realize that there's the racism, but sometimes that's been a tool to kind of forget about the fact that there's actually people who live in the same kind of circumstances than you, or at least are kind of as helpless to a bigger economic system.
Mm-hmm.
That's really kind of indifferent to anything other than profits. So But thank you so much, Jeremy, for doing this, and thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right, take care,
Come
Jeremy.
visit
Say,
me. Come visit me in Houston. I'll be here, and I'm not kidding.
all
That
right,
you want to come see Houston, you can get my contact from the show, whatever, and come see me. I'm not kidding. You too. We're waiting.
all right. I would love to make that happen. All right, thank you, Jeremy. Take care.
Thank you.